research-based charities like the SMF to digest all the material we want. So thank you for doing that as well.
Indeed. I was going to say, in a way, it sort of reminds me of, I don't know if you consciously thought of this, but it's almost like medical science. That meta-analysis is the thing that actually helps the individual patients understand what's happening to them and what their chances are. Yeah. I've had a bit of experience of that in recent years, and it's absolutely crucial. And, in a sense, I think for political practitioners, this sort of analysis is so much more valuable than individual insights of research papers. So thank you very much for doing this. I will skip through my hundreds of points that this research sort of raised in my head. I'm going to assume that the context that we've all decided for this conversation is that we are now in a phony war in a run-up to an expected general election in 2024. If you think that's not the context, I'd be interested why that's what I've decided the context is. I think Hannah will agree with me. In which case, my observations are very much kind of, political, rather than sort of academic, since I am just a journalist. I was so interested in this concept of the different interpretations, depending on who you are, of the same policies and the same interventions. And it seems to me every single election I hear people from various parties talk about fairness, whether a policy is fair. And I think, here we go, because that word has millions of different definitions depending on who you are, depending on all the factors that Alex has outlined for why your opinion on policy might be different. So I think sort of as we sort of go into kind of a rhetoric heavy year or 18 months or whatever it is, 15 months, when you hear politicians use that word, what this policy is the fair way to go, who are they addressing that to? Because it's not the same people who interpret fair, and I suppose the sort of spectrum, I don't know if Chris would agree with this, but the spectrum on that is sort of every stage on the spectrum between society is horrifically unequal and we must do maximal redistribution of wealth and income, over to I've worked hard, this is my money, why are you taking it away from me? I will provide for my family as a priority, as my priority. Where people sit on that spectrum is incredibly important for how you make a policy go over in a crisis. And so I think all your work in this paper on the balancing act of targeting those in need and ensuring support by actually arguing that there are knock-on benefits, even if they're just knock-on or possibly direct benefits to as many sections of society as possible. That is the political balancing act at the moment, because the background to this election is going to be economic pain, and whether it eases or not, as you say, we don't know. And if it eases, I guess the incumbents are in a better position than they look right now. But so how both parties actually can pull off that message, both the policy and the selling of the policy, the framing of what you're selling as a fair outcome and a fair intervention is going to be absolutely crucial. My own sort of policy background is education, and I think that's quite an interesting kind of case study area of where successes have been achieved in the past by politicians arguing for redistributive policies and spending, and also where they've screwed up. And I could bore on about that forever, but I won't. I'm also sort of interested, when we get onto wider discussions, what people think of previous efforts in recent elections to talk about this wider pool of beneficiaries, whether it's Theresa May's jams or even Ed Miliband's squeeze middle, or our median voter, he or she. So I'm interested in that. I'm very interested in this concept in the paper of the kind of what I suppose, I've had this terrible head cold, and a colleague said to me, it's the long arm of winter, which I think is quite a good metaphor for what you're talking about in this study. You've got economic pain now. How far is that going to reach into the future if there starts to be a recovery, and who benefits? So that sort of, not just discontent now, but lingering discontent. I think that's going to be really important for the election, and you've got lots of strong stuff in there on that. I wondered, Jane, if you could say a bit, sorry, James, I hope I'm not sort of intervening wrongly, but Jane's previous work on insecurity and how broad that was across the electorate, and how in what surprising places you found these pockets of economic insecurity and how that affects voting. I wonder how you thought this new work meshed with that piece of work. And lastly, I suppose probably all of us are going to be really fascinated by the parts of this study that look at the non-rational aspects of how the electorate thinks about these questions of redistribution. And I suppose, I don't know if is this on? Yes, it is. I suppose I feel very strongly, having watched sort of opponents of the Conservative incumbents fail again and again, that it would be really useful for everyone else in politics, and that's both people who want policy changes and also other opposition parties, to really think carefully about arguments that are worth having with the electorate on sort of what might be the rational way forward, and arguments that really aren't worth having with the electorate because they believe what they believe, And redistribution and what redistribution you choose to go for is a really key area for that, I think. For example, I would really recommend my colleague at the FT, Chris Giles, wrote a fantastic piece sort of attacking the whole idea of, I suppose, homo economicus, is that the phrase, over the question of inheritance tax. People are really attached to the idea of providing for their family. And you can sort of have another 15-year row with voters about why they feel that, or you could just think maybe we'll find some other ways to raise a lot of money and that might be better and not offend people about how they feel about their family. And that's about the end of my I've got so many more thoughts, but I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you very much, Miranda. All questions and queries we put to Jane, obviously, the better, I think. Obviously, I'm sure the audience will have them too. I have some, but so it's all very well. And now we'll get Chris Curtis, who I'm sure has more questions for you put to our speakers. So.
I do indeed. I mean, it's coming last. I have most of the points that I'm going to make have been said, so I might be a bit short. But firstly, I think it's really important to thank both of you for doing this work. One of the, forget redistribution, one of the great things that I think changes we should make in politics is people listening to people like Jane and Alex a lot more, and charlatans on Politics Live who are just trying to sell books and pretending to be political scientists a little bit less, not naming any names. But another...
No one here has any idea what you're talking about.
I don't like Matt Goodwin. There's a big argument that's been happening in politics over the last few years, and I think we've probably shifted too far the other way in this conversation between the emotional and the rational bit of our brain. I think since Brexit's a really good example of this, people decided after Brexit that voters are just sort of driven by emotion, and there isn't, a rational element to it. People aren't thinking, is this decision going to, make me better off? And I think this is another piece of evidence that actually shows most of the decisions that people are making are broadly, in politics, in life, how they vote in elections, are broadly still decided by, is this decision going to make me better or worse off? If you take the Brexit referendum as a good example of this, I'm going slightly off tangent, but it's important. Just 21% of voters thought that they were going to be worse off if we voted to leave the European Union. They've changed their mind on that now, but that's what they thought at the time. You compare that to the Scottish referendum, where 42% of people thought they'd be worse off if Scotland voted for independence. The point being that, I think the narrative that was written after the referendum is a load of working class people who were wound up by immigrants voted for something that was against their economic self-interest, because that's the narrative Westminster wrote. It's not true. Voters weren't convinced that it was against their economic self-interest to vote to leave the European Union. I make that point because this is another body of research looking at all of the evidence from over 100 papers that shows that actually weighing up your economic self-interest is one of the most important things in making decisions like this. I'm in the room of academics mostly academics, a lot of academics in this room who I'm sure note that point, but within the square mile surrounding us, I think that there's been a shift in views to thinking arguments around that no longer hold much water. The other point I'd just make quickly, just because I think it's worth noting, is obviously there's a point in here about the cost of living crisis not necessarily dramatically, or not, it won't necessarily change people's views on redistribution. But I still think it's worth noting that despite, I think it will in many ways, but despite that fact, it is also worth noting that we have had 13 years of the thermostat effect kicking in. Voters are significantly more positive and supportive of measures to do with redistribution than they would have been 13 years ago, because that's what happens when you have 13 years of Conservative government. So I think I don't think it's useful for I don't think it's right for one of the takeaways for this to be a level of nervousness about an incoming Labour government putting in place redistributive policies, because they are a lot more popular than they have been for most of my lifetime.
Just on that, just to interrupt, because I'm not sure we build you as such in the material for the event.
Okay.
Just for total transparency, Chris, as well as being associate director at Attitudinal and therefore leading opinion pollster, is also the Labour PPC for Milton Keynes North, and so he may well be coming back here in a year and a half's time. Just to speak as Labour MP. So it's pure.
So there is a massive conflict of interest here, and bear that in mind when I'm talking. But I'll finish off. I'll finish off on the political point then, in terms of what I think the important bits are from this research in terms of an incoming progressive government of any shape, which I hope will be a Labour one. Firstly, it is really important, as you say from this research, to widen the group that you talk about with redistributive politics. I think in the past, the Labour Party has fallen into the trap of just talking about the very poorest people in society and how much they care about them. And as we've seen from this piece of research, it's really important to make sure that group is widest. If the Conservatives try and win elections by basically bribing the 51% richest to screw the 49% poorest, it's kind of important that the Labour Party does talk about those people in the middle as well, and an offer it's got to help them. And when you have the sort of income and wealth distribution that we have in this country, redistributive measures are helping. Good redistributive measures are supporting and helping the majority of the population. It is in the economic self-interest of the majority of the population to have more redistribution and a more equal society. But also, I think the important point is kind of about trust. It's all right sort of talking about redistributive policies or things that you're going to do about that, but if nobody kind of believes they're going to work or trusts you and able to do that, to be able to put them in place, that counts for absolutely nothing. So a Labour Party, a progressive party, does need to be talking about making sure that this money isn't wasteful. It needs to be making sure it's talking about how it's going to be, it's not just going to be taxed from people and disappear into the ether. Also, you do have to create, from all of the work we've done in all of the focus groups and polling we've done, you do have to create losers as well as winners. Too often left-wing parties talk about, where things they're going to spend money on in redistribution. They don't talk about where that money is going to come from in the first place. You do actually have to do both of those pieces of work together. That's why we've heard a lot from the Labour Party, for example, about the idea of a windfall tax or going after non-doms, because it's those policies that bring in the money that you can then redistribute, because otherwise people don't believe that you're going to be able to implement any of these policies in the first place. Or you get the magic money tree, more borrowing kind of arguments from the Conservatives. And the final point, and the point you were making about the sort of argument over what isn't or does and doesn't count as fairness is important, because I think a lot of the time policies around redistribution are described by the right-wing press and the right as being unfair in and of themselves. And I think they're making sure that they're sort of putting that counter-argument forward about actually how redistributive policies of this nature are fair. I think it's critical in order to get public support for these kind of things. And the final point I'll make just at the bottom here, just because Miranda touched on it as well, is I think it is important to bear in mind, like quite often we do take quite a long time in politics to catch up with the economic reality of the country, and it's important to note, just as the fantastic other work that Jane's worked on, that the demographic and the makeup of the people in this country who are the most screwed has changed quite significantly over the past few years. It isn't so much the case that people who do jobs that we would class in very outdated definitions as working class and a pensioners around their house are the people that necessarily need the most support in the way that they might have done 20, 30 years ago. There are a lot of, I've talked about wand voters, working age voters with no degrees. They're the voter group in this country that are most economically insecure right now, quite often most in needing of help and support, as opposed to maybe, doing more like they did in the 90s to really boost up the state pension. So we also, when we're thinking about redistribution measures, we have to think about how the sort of economically insecure group has changed over the past 20, 30 years, and make sure that the policies that we put in place reflect that reality.
Thank you, Chris. Now I'm going to abuse my prerogative as chair. I abuse my prerogative as chair, I suppose, and just put a couple of questions I've extracted from the things Chris and Miranda have been saying, and in the presentation, to Jane and Alex. So two things to get your thoughts on. One is really more of one observation was their question, but it was definitely a question. The observation, actually, like Chris and like Miranda, I think most strikes me reading the research, listening to you. Actually, and it's great that you come to a think tank to say this, is that your point about needing a broader base for welfare policies redistribution is a real sort of challenge to articles of faith for policy wonks. I mean, most people who do this sort of thing, who sit in these rooms, we spend a lot of time talking about devising and promoting policies that more narrowly target the allocation of public resource. The thing that annoys us most is when governments just hand out loads of cash to everybody. And in that, I think we actually were a mirror of certainly official attitudes, not just in Treasury, possibly other bits of the state. There is always a search, partly for fiscal reasons, but partly maybe for intellectual, ideological reasons, for solutions that involve targeting resource narrowly rather than giving away money to wider groups. And so I'm just curious to know, any thoughts you have on how the mindset, I guess I'm trying to represent here, how how us clever pointy-headed people have all reached this conclusion that targeting is better than the broad-based policies that you're talking about here, as a better way of keeping buy-in for the social security and welfare state. The question, I suppose, is to bring this down into sort of party politics that Chris was talking about a little. Is it fair to take away from this research that the conclusion that if a Labour Party is going to win the next general election and have some sort of mandate for a degree of redistribution, then that Labour Party has a little bit further to go in terms of making the argument? In that, there is a certain sense you sometimes pick up that the Labour Party will run the next general election campaign and base that question on a backward-looking, on a backward-looking question. Are you better off now than you were 5 years or 13 years ago? To run a Reagan question. But isn't the real point we take away from this that its future expectations matter a lot more than past experience? And so Chris and his colleagues, if they are going to win a mandate for a significant degree of redistribution, are going to have to tap into that idea of what is coming next. And I you mentioned you used the word automation. I thought that was a very interesting discussion. I hope people here will have questions for you about the future shape of the labour market and technology and how that might affect redistributive attitudes. But so those are questions actually. Why are people like me wrong about everything? And what Chris is his Labour colleagues and politicians more widely need to do when they are thinking about framing and delivering their election campaigns in the next 18 months or so. I don't know if you want to. Nobody wants to.
I'm just going to take a stab at a couple of questions, I think, and then I'll pass over to Alex, and then you can sort of look at me if you want to jump in or something. So it's really kind of Miranda and Chris and James to reflect so thoughtfully on this piece of work. So thank you very much indeed. It's also really kind of you both to reference the work that I was talking about last year. So just a bit of context, this was about economic insecurity, and it was, I think, kind of the engine behind some of these thoughts, as well as wider work around what do we really mean when we talk about economic difficulties and concerns, and how should we as kind of social scientists start to go about thinking about that? How should we measure that? And how much do people's expectations about the long term factor into their concerns about what's happening now? So there is some overlap, I think, in what that might tell us. And what I was arguing then was that we needed to think about economic insecurity, not just income, because income doesn't tell us about those younger graduates who have very good long-term expectations. They might not be as good as the expectations their parents thought they might have, and lots has changed and the benchmarks have changed. But relatively speaking, we need to think about those long-term expectations for security, potential to buy houses and things like that. And we also need to think about generational changes in the way the economy has really transformed over time, and who really does feel secure. And those people may have low incomes. So pensioners may have low incomes but feel very secure because of assets and so on. So that was the kind of argument there. And I think what our work speaks to in that is two things. One is the wand voters. So Chris came up with a much better, snappier way of describing the working age non-graduates. And
No degree. It
With
can't be
no-
non-graduates, else the acronym doesn't work.
no degree, sorry. Working age with no degree. So, and this was also about people's Brexit attitudes, their immigration concerns, their social conservatism, and who feels economically insecure. And those working age without non-degree voters were more likely to feel economically insecure. And I wonder how much of that is about long-term expectations, given the way the economy is going, given, some of those of us, who are fortunate to feel relatively secure in this particular economic context. Obviously things have got a lot harder, to have that confidence for the future. I think that's probably a really important factor for those voters. I also wondered, one of the things that we looked at, this is British Election Study research, was who is feeling really insecure now. So what was the change? And it was really interesting that older voters in particular, or older individuals in particular, were feeling very insecure compared to before the crisis. So it was still the same pattern. Everyone was feeling worse off, everyone was feeling more insecure, but the older voters were feeling, there was a kind of noticeable shift amongst that group. And it strikes me too that these are the people that don't have kind of future income returns on which they can buffer their current economic difficulties. And so you've got what you've got once you've retired, in a way, through your house prices, of course, and that's going to, that'll be hugely important if there's a big housing shock. But I think that might be one of the reasons that we need, we think about older generations and their vulnerability. It's precisely because, they aren't able to kind of radically change their economic circumstances going forward. They might be trapped also in liquid assets. So I think these things are there's lots of crossover. I think it's really interesting. I think we need to think really hard about what we really mean when we think about the economy and what people's thoughts and feelings and attitudes and expectations are, and measure them better as social scientists. I've been doing, basically there's a common theme to all of my work, was like, let's measure this thing better, and then let's see what we find out when we do that. We're doing a big project at the moment on intergenerational attitudes as well, which will be launching in June. So that's very much speaks to that. Will is here from the Fairness Foundation, and when Miranda was asking the question, what is fairness, and how all of these factors bear on people's attitudes around what the state should do, it just makes me think we need lots and lots more studies on what is fairness, and I know that we'll have thoughts to contribute to that. So is Labour retrospective is the story that Labour needs to tell about the future as opposed to the past. And I don't know if I would say the future is more important. I'm not sure that we can really disentangle that empirically very well. It would be kind of the thing about, and I'm going to wrap this up because I could literally go on about this for ages, but the thing about the economy is that it's not just, are you feeling poor now? It's not just, are you feeling that you're going to be okay in 2 years' time? It's also, this was a really big competence signal. And it was a really big moment where people, if you look at the polling, if you look at long-term polling on the economy, who do you trust on the economy, that just switches around about at the time of the Truss period of government and all of that. And it's very unlikely that's going to switch back. It might improve a little bit, but it's very unlikely that's going to switch back. So the past is not just about, we've had a crisis, you've been poorer. It's also, can you trust this government? And of course, we all know this, but it's the kind of in the round of how voters think about these things. But I think future expectations is a really important thing for us to think on, and it's a really important thing for Labour. I mean, if Labour came into government and just kept on doing the same old thing of, well, that they gave us a terrible hand and we were stuck with it, that's not going to wash either. And obviously it helps a bit. It's helped for the Conservatives to say, well, there was a global financial crisis and then there was austerity, we had to do it, and the level of UK debt. And of course, that's part of the narrative. but I think people are looking to have confidence and security into the future and wanting to see, and certainly benchmarking that with countries that have rebounded quicker from this potential crisis is a really important part of the story there and the signal to the electorate. Alex, would you like to add anything, things I didn't cover?
Yeah, so I had just two things I wanted to add really. The first is that in the piece we have this sort of big paragraph caveating why we're comfortable talking about attitudes, but we're not that comfortable talking about voting. And I think the reason is, as we've shown with attitudes, it's complicated enough to try to understand how these things will shift. But then when you make the step from attitudes to voting, there's so much else going on. And as Jane said, these questions of, it's not necessarily just the thing that you want the government to do, but then questions about competence, questions about evaluations of what's gone in the past, then also become important. So I think that distinction is useful to note. I also think the other point I wanted to raise was about this point, James, that you raised about have the think tanks got it wrong, and I don't think so. But I think one useful way to think about this is that when there is a very acute need, clearly in the short term, targeting a policy is from a pure welfare perspective, sort of enhancing people who really do need that support, it is the best approach. But in the longer term, buying political buy-in and keeping that policy around for a longer period of time, the calculation is different, and it's a political or normative question what type of consideration you want to make. And I guess if it's devising one particular policy for the here and now versus for the longer period, they're different things. And I think the only other thing I would say is that often really general, broad brush government spending programs, even though they benefit everybody and they create a larger sense of buy-in, they implicitly benefit people on lower incomes more. And really good examples of this would be sort of big, broad brush spending schemes like the furlough scheme, or even aspects of public health spending and NHS spending. They are there for everybody and everybody feels a sense of ownership for them. But when you look at the beneficiaries of the spending, it predominantly goes to people who are on lower incomes to start off with. So in a sense, you can kill two birds with one stone. You can have a policy that is more durable from an electoral or from an attitudinal perspective, but you can also continue benefiting people who are the most in need.
No, the thought occurs. It's an intriguing. Thank you both very much for that. It's an intriguing sort of side consequence of those two policies you mentioned: the energy bills, the energy price support, and furlough. That effectively Rishi Sunak, who I would not think of himself as a champion of redistribution, may just have overseen two policies that are long-term drivers of attitudinal support for net positive for support for redistribution, which I'm sure as a thought would delight him. Now we will go to our audience today. You've all come along with brilliant questions, observations, your thoughts and challenges, and you will all immediately tell us who you are and where you come from, and you will all end your questions with a question mark, or at least raise a little voice, rather than giving speeches. So right, I've now. Are we doing mics to the audience, or?
I think you can.
Yeah, I think we can. Yeah, you just shout at us. Yes.
I was expected to. So, as somebody who's one of perhaps the few people in the room who have argued against targeting for more years than I like to think, I find your research extremely comforting. I think it does have implications for. I mean, I'm a Labour peer. And I've argued, and I'm strengthening now my argument, that we should be arguing for a social security system that benefits us all, and putting emphasis on security. And Brandon, I'm sorry, Jane, I didn't know about your research on economic insecurity, because I do think security is such an important factor, and it's something that binds people on middle income and low incomes, feelings of insecurity. So I think that we should much greater emphasis on that. I mean, two questions. One is, we all expected that attitudes would become more pro redistribution, pro social security as a result of the pandemic and more people having to claim universal credit and so forth. And I don't think actually that has been shown to be the case. So I'd be interested in why you think that is the case, given what you found in your meta-analysis. And the second question is, taking what you've said to the logical conclusion, it could be used as an argument for basic income, and I wonder whether you agree with that.
Thank you very much for this. Shall we put those to the pandemic and UBI questions to Jane and Alex first, then I'll come to Miranda and Chris for their thoughts in response. Again, I don't know if should we give up the microphones and just shout?
Sorry, I realised I never said you out because you said.
Sorry.
I went through this.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah. Sorry. Are we? You. How a microphone if you want one. Up to you.
Hello. They make a funny noise as well, I doubt. It's really difficult to speak clearly with them. So I'll just hold it a bit further away as a compromise. So colleagues at UCL worked with us on the election study actually to try to, during the pandemic, to exactly address this question, thinking, and we all did, didn't we? Thinking, goodness me, this is going to change everything. And they found that there were no null findings of changes around kind of redistribution attitudes as a result of things like furlough payments and so on. Now, that is what I think about that. I don't know what Alex thinks about that. Is what I think the problem there is, though, is you're looking at aggregate level shifts. And what our research is pointing to is that we need to go lift up the bonnet of the car and look at those kinds of under the surface factors around expectations about recovery, around expectations of beneficiaries, and so on and so forth, like these 5 factors that we've highlighted. I mean, it would be very gratifying for us as if it was exactly that. I suspect it would throw up something that we haven't thought about, that the research hasn't thought about. I mean, the important thing that we should say here is that this is the research that exists to date. Someone could come along in 5 years' time and show us something new. But it seems to me that that's the issue there, that, we wouldn't expect to see an aggregate shift, but we might want to look at these expectations and different considerations around beneficiaries and so on. Is this an argument for basic income? Do you want to take this, Alex, or do you want to?
I could try. Because the academic literature on basic income, it tends to focus more on the economic outcomes that basic income introduces. So whether people are more likely to get into employment or whether people are more likely to report measures of subjective well-being and satisfaction. As far as I'm aware, there's not that much that looks at the attitudinal consequences or the political consequences. I think just speaking personally, I am quite sympathetic to the argument that it is somewhere of a conclusion, but I think there are a lot of steps between. So I'm going to cover it.
Thank you. Chris and Miranda, and thoughts on UBI very welcome, particularly on the pandemic. Why hasn't the pandemic changed politics and political attitudes more? Given, as Jane says, we all sat around and said, this could change everything. I wrote a dozen columns saying this changes everything, and very little change, did it?
I think part of the reason is we're all busy talking about other things, right? Like, particularly coming out of the pandemic, when you think about the political discussion that was happening, we were talking about how we get the economy back up and running again. We were talking about how we get NHS waiting lists. There was just a lot more things for our politics to focus on rather than to have a big academic debate about redistribution. I will just re-emphasise my other point, though, that I was making earlier, because yes, it is true that the pandemic didn't have a dramatic shift on these attitudes. It's also true that potentially, I think slightly less so, the cost of living won't. But we still shouldn't forget the fact that there has been a massive shift on attitudes towards redistribution in terms of state spending, in terms of tax and spend. We are incredibly progressive as a country on all of those questions now, significantly more progressive than we were on any of those questions 10 years ago. We can have arguments about these specific events, but the big driver, and it happens in the UK, it happens all around the world, is the longer you've had a right-wing government for, the more left-wing people become on these questions. The longer you've had a left-wing government for, the more right-wing people become on these questions. So it should be surprising. It's probably one of the biggest difficulties for the Conservatives in the next election is just because of that basic fact, which has held out for most of political science history in most countries where we've looked at this. Just because of that basic political science fact, it's going to be it's going to make life very difficult for the Conservatives at the next election. There's something I'm probably not best to say it, but I'll say it anyway. There's something that's worth pointing out about the sort of point you're making about why wonks, if you don't mind me calling you that, have a slightly different conclusion to this research. And it's like you're kind of trying to ask a slightly different question. Like what Jay and Alex are trying to explore here is public attitudes and how to get public support for these kind of measures. Now, as somebody who wants a more progressive state, I know that we can only do it if we bring the public along with us. And one of the reasons that comes back to why I'm, if you look at the big progressive policies that have stood the test of time, things like child benefit, which was universal for a long period of time, because it was universal. It's the National Health Service. These are things that have managed to stay in the test of time, that have been fantastic progressive causes, and they've managed to stay because they've been universal in nature. So I actually think there's a real strong argument for those kind of policies because of that. And the other point I would make is if you do want to make an argument, it's not black and white, right? Like there will be places where we will need to do more targeted support. The big thing about when you do want to have targeted policies is that we're absolutely useless at being able to do targeted policies at the country, and that's the essay question that we need to answer there. When it came to Rishi Sunak tried to target his energy support package at first. The best thing he could come up with to try and target this policy in terms of who should get support was council tax bans. Like we as a country, the best way we had to have a massive economic intervention, we tried to target it, and the best we could come up with was council tax bans based on what your house price was 30 years ago. That's how bad as a country we are at doing targeted policies. And my view is that actually, if you are sitting in the Treasury and you do want to be thinking about how you can do targeted policies more effectively, and that is part of the solution despite my previous comments. The real question is how can we be better at that? How can we make sure we can join up data across the state between income and welfare and health records and house prices and everything else to make sure that we can have a much better job at that?
Since we're speaking among friends, I'm happy to say that on Friday morning I was in the Treasury talking to some officials about how to join up data better to deliver better targeting of future policy and funding. Because you're absolutely right.
It's my passion.
The mechanisms for doing so are very limited, but there is work underway to build better ones. I promise. But we can sidetrack. Miranda can enjoy your thoughts on the pandemic. If you want to chip in on why I'm wrong about everything as well, that's fine. That's
other people are doing that so well that I'll give you a break from that. This question of sort of why there wasn't the expected massive uptick in feelings of solidarity after the pandemic. I mean, as James has said, I can vividly remember being on a panel, an international virtual panel in the first weeks of the pandemic, in which everybody was talking about UBI. There was somebody from Scandinavia, there was somebody from Spain. We were all, the world was thrown up and was going to land in a much more benign place. And I found in this great piece of work we were talking about today, I think I found the reference to the negative piece of research. The onset of the pandemic made some sections of the electorate more accepting of inequality. Is that the one? That could be. Different one. Anyway, there we are. Sad, but as they say, maybe different things will actually come out longer term in the impact. And I think one thing that actually has already come out is the opposite, which is if you actually look at what people are upset about at the moment in this country, it's this feeling of private wealth and public squalor, which may not be technically about being pro-redistribution, but it's actually unhappiness about the public realm and how it's being cared for. And that's everything from sewage in the rivers to the state of the NHS and everything in between. So actually, I think there's a suppressed unhappiness about the public realm, which, whilst it's not sort of exactly tax policy, is a wider unhappiness and yearning for some sort of social solidarity, in fact. So I feel relatively optimistic about change on that basis. That's very, very non-homo economicus answer.
Yes, we get on to rationality. Next question, I think we go for Will from Fairness, and then we're going to go Alex and across that way. So Will.
Thanks, James. Yeah, Will Snell from the Fairness Foundation. Question for Alex and Jane. But first, also briefly to say on Miranda's point about fairness that, yeah, absolutely huge variation in people's conceptions. Our recent polling has found that there is an increasing consensus, including among a good chunk of Tory voters, that in order to provide fair opportunities, you need to reduce inequality. So that's why we're seeing an increase in convergence of opinion. Obviously, there's complexity around that. My question for Jane and Alex was around wealth and whether you found, as part of the literature research, that changes in amount and wealth and inequality of that and people's position in the wealth distribution was also having an impact on attitudes, whether you deliberately excluded that from scope in order to make the work somewhat manageable.
Okay.
Good crisp question. Wealth, what's that about?
Okay, thanks, Will. And what we try to do is, think about wealth and income as two parts of what makes someone feel well off or not. So we're not excluding assets and we're not excluding savings and different forms of wealth. But we're trying to think about becoming poorer and which groups should feel the most which groups move into a state of genuine economic precarity due to an income shock or a wealth shock or some kind of economic shock. One of the interesting things, I know Alex will probably elaborate on this, one of the interesting debates in the literature is around heavily leveraged individuals who are middle incomes. So those people that essentially income shocks are really important to them because they have very substantial housing debt, mortgages and so on. And I think that's certainly an interesting set of ideas. It's certainly an interesting set of arguments, but it's always relative. It's always relative to those people that don't have the benefit of even having those assets or those other forms of savings or other forms of wealth to fall back on. So it's just really important, I think, not to. You don't want to get into a situation where we're saying, but these are the people that feel really poorly off because they've got large houses. We need to bear in mind that it's all relative. Do you want to elaborate, Alex?
Yeah, so as Jane said in the piece, we did think about this a while because there are important theoretical differences between wealth and income, mostly because income fluctuates more. I think there are a few observations that suggest that there are some overlaps. So for instance, there's a lot of work in the UK and the US in particular that looks at fluctuations in housing prices in different parts of different countries. And essentially there's this very robust finding that if you live in a neighborhood where house prices are going down, you become more supportive of government redistribution. If you live in an area where house prices are going up, you become less supportive. And I think there's some work that has done similar looking at voting for populist parties in Europe as well. And so I think the idea there would be that this is an extension of what we were talking about, expected future income, that maybe we can think of wealth as a security, as a safety net. And I think equally, it suggests there's going to be another really interesting episode of potential shifts in public opinion as the sort of massive intergenerational transfer of wealth that is inevitably going to happen over the next 20, 30 years starts to probably take place, and whether people's longer term calculations about what they can afford, what sort of lifestyle they can have, what type of career they need to embark on, changes based on whether they think they're going to receive an inheritance before or not. So I think they're different, but there are some overlaps where I think our sort of implications would also be applied to wealth.
Thank you very much. And the next hand was to Alex Murdoch.
Thank you very much, and thank you for remembering my name. I'm what I suppose you call it academic. I float around in academia now. I've got a couple of points. One is simply around the issue of the potential social mobility, which from my understanding has declined. And in fact has declined significantly and is at the lowest point now it's been for quite a long time. Even the suggestion that Hilary Mantel would say there was more social mobility at the time of Henry VIII than there is now. But that's one thing, the question about whether people feel that the reality is they're likely to move from where they are to somewhere else. And the second one is really about, and I've lived up north for a number of years, issue about what your reference group is. And if your reference group locally is people who are very much akin to you, then small differences make big difference, are there. But if your reference group is if you're living in North Kensington and you're looking south at Chelsea, then you've got a very different attitude. You're the poor man at the gate, the rich man in the castle. And so I just wondered whether those two aspects, the attitude to potential social mobility, and also what is your local reference group, whether it's geographical, occupational, or whatever.
Well, we get thoughts from Jane Alex, and I'm keen to get Chris and Miranda possibly to comment, particularly on the social mobility point. At the risk of advertising future SMF products, on Thursday morning we'll be back in this room with Ali McGovern, who is the Labour Shadow Social Mobility Minister, giving a speech entitled "Putting Social Mobility Back on the Agenda," because our thought was that people at Westminster haven't been talking about it very much of late. So if you're keen on that, come back to that. But Jane Alex on social mobility and reference groups, and I'll come to Chris and Miranda.
Thank you. These are really interesting points. I think I was just tempted earlier when Chris was talking to answer questions with a different hat on, really, which was much more, let's learn and talk about the election and which groups matter. But I do think what's really interesting is what isn't said. And I think, the awareness of that fact around social mobility isn't, I suspect, broadly known. It was something that colleagues at Nuffield College have been working on for years. John Goldthorpe and colleagues had written a new book about this, and I remember going to the talk and thinking, oh my goodness, and one of the findings as well was around women who were going to university. They weren't getting a benefit from university education in the same way that newer generations of men going to university were. So I just don't think it's well known, and I think I might be wrong, but I think if it were better known, then that might be really actually very politically important, because of all of these issues around expectations and around confidence and security and how we think about what the state needs to do and what government needs to do. So I think it's really important. I think the other aspect of that is generational comparison, which we haven't really kind of addressed here, because we're looking at attitudes toward redistribution. The work on generational comparisons and attitudes hasn't started yet, really, in terms of dealing with redistribution attitudes, as it's kind of what we would say it's dependent variable, it's kind of outcome of interest. But it is something that we'll be working on more over the coming months, but I'll try not to change hats.
I wanted to come back to this question about reference groups, because I think it's really, really important. One of the big things we talk about when we're sort of scoping the review is this difference between perceptions versus sort of more objective changes in your income, and whether it's more important what actually happens to your wallet, or whether it's more important what you think has happened to your wallet. And I think for lots of people, those things are they're very tightly correlated. Most people won't have a perception that is miles off what is actually happening. But there is some evidence that people's immediate social circles do matter for this. And there's this big literature in social psychology which has this concept called social sampling. And it's this idea that your ideas about how other people are doing is actually drawn from a very narrow sample of people that you interact with regularly, rather than a representative opinion poll of the entire country. And some studies have applied that to preferences over political questions, including redistribution attitudes. And there is evidence that when you think your friends are doing better than you, you think you're doing worse off, even if compared to some sort of objective question. So I think it's a really important question. And it has implications for the sort of geographies of support across different parts of the country as well.
Thank you. Chris, thoughts particularly on social mobility, but also on comparing yourselves to others. Who wants to go first?
Well, I'm happy to talk about social mobility if that's. Have we decided I don't need this? I'm going to talk about it anyway. So the social mobility thing, I'm very pleased that you did ask about this, and James' response was very interesting too. And I'll definitely tune in to James's event with Ali McGovern, because it was notable that on the Labour left, the very phrase social mobility was sort of disavowed in favour of social justice instead. during the Corbyn era. And I thought it was a very interesting period because in a way, it was seen as, social mobility in action was seen as creaming off, but also focusing in political circles on social mobility, I think was seen as a bit of a fig leaf for not actually addressing underlying inequality. And I hope if it's coming back into fashion in Labour circles, what will have happened is that the whole debate will have moved on to acknowledge that both are extremely important and you have to do both.
You should ask Chris if it's going back into Labour circles.
Yes, Chris, you are Labour circles or purposes. And actually, I would really recommend a book by Duncan Exley. I don't know if you guys know it, but it's called The End of Aspiration. It's his personal story, but he's also an expert scientist, social scientist on this area. Because it's incredibly important. And actually, to your point about insecurity, if people feel insecure, this isn't just economic, it affects their life decisions, it affects whether they feel able to change jobs, it affects whether they feel able to move to a different geographical area and all the advantages that might bring them. So, it's all part of the mix. And I'm going to pass over to Chris on that. But I'm very pleased if social mobility is allowed to be part of the conversation again.
How do I say this? I think there's this argument that quite often happens. I'm going to oversimplify and sort of badge aspiration, social mobility together just for 1 second, just to oversimplify a bit, if you don't mind. I accept that there's differences between those two terms. I think the problem is that you as a state, as people, we need to have economic security before we can do the aspiration stuff. You have to do the first one. I would argue you have to give people the first one before you give them the second one. The problem is, as a country, when everybody's got economic security, then you can really focus on, okay, now how can we build more social mobility? How can we, get everybody to reach their potential in life? And I think the Labour Party will do a lot of work on doing that. We have Alison McGovern's got a job with it in the job title, right? Yeah. It's not something that we don't consider important. But the problem is that too many people, I've sat in focus groups time after time after time, and if you try talking to them about social mobility, they don't believe a bloody word of it. Because none of people are going to decide the next election. Many of them are, really worried about their energy bills going up. They're really worried about, the paycheck not extending to the end of the month. And they'd love to be thinking about how they can, all of the social mobility questions and how they can aspire. But firstly, they just need to make sure that they've got the paycheck in place and getting the energy bill next month. So I think it is far more important for the next Labour government to be putting that security in place for people before we go on to focus necessarily on the ideas of social mobility. I hope that we can do both. But I think that is the main reason why the agenda, the narrative and the things people talk about has shifted. It's just because basically we've had 13 years of the Conservatives screwing so much up that so many people are feeling so much poorer. But there's something else that we've got to get done first.
As a cross-party think tank, I'm going to ban any further partisan points in the remaining 8 minutes we have left. I think in those 8 minutes we'll try and get probably 2 more questions. Now Mary Jessica's hand's up. Should we do 2 questions together? So the gentleman in the red t-shirt there. So it's Mary first, and then.
Mary Jessica, I write a column for the Independent and various other people. I've got two questions, which is sort of related. I was very struck by Alex talking about deserving and undeserving. This is such an ancient concept, and that it's still there, but politicians seem to veer away from it at a speed of knots. Why is it not capitalised on? Second thing is, one of the things that I was surprised about after the pandemic was that people who'd been made redundant and who'd lost a lot from the pandemic were shocked at the level of benefits, that there were flat rate benefits and they had no relation to previous income, as in most places on the continent. And the reason for this, generally given, is that on the continent benefits are largely contributory. And I'm surprised that after the pandemic, there doesn't seem to have been any move or any sort of agitation for more contributory benefits.
Thank you, Mary. And then the gentleman in the red shirt.
Matt Bowles from Crisis. Yeah, I think my question is just about touching on the issue of trust, and whether or not massive decline that we've seen in trust in public bodies and politicians will form is a barrier to people trusting the ability of the state to perform a redistributive function.
Thank you. We'll do all 53 questions there in one round, and then I'll round off by giving Jane and Alex and Ishmael any closing thoughts that they have. So, no particular desert, contributing benefits, and trust. I don't know how you want to pass those up into turn to our left.
Yeah. I guess I can open with talking about the deservingness question, because I agree. I mean, I think deservingness is used by politicians, right? It's just used in the other way, and I think. I mean, I won't sound partisan. Very. I'll try and be careful, but I think this move towards making some groups seem less deserving has been incredibly effective at changing the conversation and the narrative about redistribution as a whole, with inevitable sort of follow-up effects on people's attitudes. And I agree with you. It's interesting that it, for some reason, seems more difficult to push that back the other way. And especially given the conversation we've had about the pandemic not having sort of longer lasting effects, because potentially questions about deservingness of support, those arguments might land when we're talking about NHS workers, key workers, and so on. So I think it's a very interesting challenge for political parties to think about. It's a really interesting point.
What do you want me to do? Sure.
Talk laudably about political reasons.
Okay, here we go.
Or sing a song, depending on what you're
Just the former, just for now.
Contributing welfare. Why hasn't contributing welfare taken hold? So there was a little bit of talk. There are hints of it in the last Conservative manifesto, and some of the people involved in that manifesto I know are very keen on contributing welfare, but it's fizzled away, hasn't it?
I was really taken back in November. I was on a Joseph Rowntree Foundation panel, and they were talking about a basket of things that you would need to actually base your universal credit calculation on, and that they had no bearing at all to the actual level of credit, of universal credit, that people were being asked to live on an arbitrary amount. And it was shocking to me. I wasn't well versed in all of that kind of policy debate. It wasn't something that I'd really become aware of. And I think there's two things. There's an awareness question. There's a kind of empirical question around your observation that those people who had to then become beneficiaries were shocked at the level of support. It would be fascinating to go back and try to dig into the data that allows us to really understand, did attitudes change amongst those people that suddenly became aware that you can't live on the level of benefits that are provided to people. I think the other broader kind of political context is this whole justification around deficit, and that we just can't afford as a country to spend any more money. And furlough was obviously incredibly expensive, and now we've got energy bills and energy bailouts and all the rest of it. And that's the language, isn't it? That's the language of, oh, well, in an ideal world, we'd be able to do this and this, but we can't afford to. So therefore, it doesn't come onto the agenda. I think the question around trust is huge, actually. And I'd love to know what Chris thinks about this, because I really wrestled with, is trust really declining? And I'm sorry, because that sounds like, obviously trust is declining. But I've really kind of wondered about that from a political science point of view, because we know that partisanship's declining and satisfaction with democracy sort of stays constant. I think what's absolutely crucial, and which our review and it's not one that I've seen any serious political work done on making sure that the most vulnerable feel confidence and the ability to access the services to which they are entitled. And I'm verging into a little soapbox moment, so I'll hastily pass over.
That's a very good point. On that left point, I'll advertise some SMF work. We have done various bits of work around social tariff and support packages available for people on low incomes. And what we do find, you do find regularly, is that when you ask people to put themselves forward for help, they don't. And there was some fears from Ofcom yesterday on uptake of social tariffs and broadband, which will essentially cut your household bills, make you better off. Millions of people don't take it up.
Yeah.
Some because they don't know it exists, and some because they don't want to. And so the default assumption that you have to ask people to put themselves forward for help does not work. So we need to find, again, back to the starting point, we're pushing help for people whether they buy it or not. Sorry, I've digressed. So Chris and Randy, these are probably your closing thoughts on desert, on contribution, on trust, and then I'm going to go back to Jane Knox for up some and next thoughts. But, I'm sorry, we need to establish a firm rule on microphones. I'm deeply erratic on the microphone. I resign. Shame.
Don't do that, Chief. That last point about the people who actually really need to trust the state, not trusting it because of the way they're treated by it, I think is absolutely key. You know, do the people making the policies really have interactions with the benefits office? No. I mean, you know, punitive benefits regime is obviously a huge problem there. I want to talk about the question of trust, bringing it back to the central thing of argument about redistribution, actually, as a final thought, which is that sort of diminishing trust, I think, can actually accidentally be a long-term consequence of redistributive policies formed at a more idealistic time, or possibly a more prosperous time. I'm thinking of the explicit argument made in the Blair-Brown years about introducing tuition fees for higher education so that more state funding could be directed towards early years and nursery education, so that you could increase people's life chances by intervening under the age of 5, which all the science shows is the crucial place to intervene. So you actually had the policy was very controversial, but it was actually redistributive because it was saying, okay, free university education is actually a massive middle class perk. We're going to attack this now so that we can put more of our energy in, you benefit as graduates, pay a share. Of course, over time, that policy has created enormous, debt issues for a generation, which also happens to be locked out of housing. Do you know what I mean? So you have trust consequences sometimes of policies that can be formulated actually in a rather idealistic, redistributive way. And of course, if the redistribution looks as if it's gone into the pockets of vice chancellors, far be it for me to criticise anyone personally. You know what I mean? So you set up trust issues sometimes with, having had the best intentions.
I just point out the SMF Board of Trustees is chaired by a University Vice Chancellor and a fine group of people you would never meet.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of those. But the problem with tuition fees is you're basically screwing a generation that's already pretty screwed. It's an extra 9% marginal tax rate. Now, if you try to put a marginal 9% tax rate on a lot of other groups in society, you'd really, really struggle. But if you put them on the people who are, struggling to buy a house, paying massive rent rates, struggling to pay their bills, apparently, that is currently considered completely acceptable. You've got people in this country not being able to afford a house and paying over 50% marginal tax rates, while apparently,
I think we're agreeing.
I know. just because you mentioned it. The point that's probably worth me touching on the most is the trust point, because I think it's the most important. The deserving, undeserving stuff significant. I think that's probably shifted away as a narrative. I think the country's for the better because of it. I think if Jeremy Hunt stood up in a budget and said, "Oh, you go to work whilst your neighbour has the curtains pulled now," he'd rightly be considered. That would rightly not go down well. And that's for the better. It's good that narrative has disappeared. There's actually quite interesting reasons why that's happened, which I think are not necessarily why people think they are, but that's for another conversation. But the trust point's really important, right? Because ultimately, you can talk about sort of redistribution in the abstract as much as you like, but unless you can convince people that putting in place a series of policies is actually going to improve the situation, it counts for absolutely nothing. And the problem is that there is not just among the lowest incomes, but among people as a whole, there is so little faith in the government's ability to achieve anything now that it harms a lot of these discussions more than almost anything else. And I think, I won't make a political point. because I get told off. But I think that if you were in a hypothetical situation like Britain, given the current political climate, an opposition leader who wanted to be in government and do much more progressive policies, I think in that hypothetical situation, I think one of your most important tasks for the next 12 months is to manage up expectations about what the government and the state can achieve. Because then you could be able to go into the next election actually making arguments of how you can make people better off. But you can only do that if you can at first win the argument that the government can solve these problems to start off with, if they are willing to do so.
The good that government can do, as somebody once said. Thank you. Now, I know I'm a couple of minutes over time, but I still want to hand it over to Jane and Alex. Really, just give a last thought. Really, it's essentially this is your chance to plug what comes next. The next systematic reviews, also where next for this work, where can they've loved it. They want to go to another one of these sessions. Where are you next appearing? Where's next?
Glastonbury.
That's it.
Yeah, right, go on, right.
And then we'll
singing.
Then we'll round off.
Just wanted to say that one of the funny indirect effects of tuition fees is, of course, academics have kind of different incentives, and we're very pressed for time. And one of the things that we wanted to do here was to invest time, resource, and proper resources into providing these sorts of systematic reviews to get them out of academia, get them out of the libraries, get all these kind of reams and reams of research away from kind of, the academic debates only and into the public sphere. And so I just really wanted to pay tribute to Nuffield College, because Nuffield College decided to support this and to give us some time and some money in order to be able to work as a team. And it's because Nuffield College believes that the role of the social sciences is to be a bridge into government and into the public spheres. So thank you. And I think I really have so enjoyed and found this so gratifying and reassuring and affirming as well of what we've been trying to work on. So thank you for coming and engaging with this. It's really amazing. And the plug is that we are working on 4 more. They're just not this ready yet. So if you'd like to find out about that, please do tell me or tell Katie, who's here. Do follow our website, Nuffield Politics Research Centre, follow us on Twitter, and we will tell you about it. We will invite you.
Just to whet their appetites, what are the 4 reviews on?
So they're a little bit more political in nature, actually. So there'll be more timely coming out around the election. So there's one on whether or not different kinds of voters, if they vote more, do they get better policy responsiveness from government? So there's one on kind of responsiveness. There's one on looking at media effects, and which Alex is working on. Tiffen is working on one around immigration attitudes. And there must be another one, which have I said them all? The other one was almost actually might come out next, we think, which is we were very preoccupied around the whole Johnson era. Do leaders really matter? So those are coming soon, and yes, please do contact me or contact Katie, watch the website and Twitter feed. We would love to see you again. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the plug. With that, I'm just going to bring to a close by thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to our friends on YouTube now and future. Possibly before you go, join me in thanking our panel, particularly the Nuffield Centre for making this all possible. But yeah, thank you.